most common atom in the universe. 74% of all atoms in the universe are hydrogen. And so hydrogen has some really interesting variables about it. So by volume, hydrogen has extremely low energy density. So at atmospheric pressure, it's about a quarter as dense as natural gas. So for that reason, for most uses, it has to be highly pressurized or put into a liquid form. But by weight, hydrogen's energy density is extremely high. So you can see down the bottom there, per kilo, hydrogen has 33.3 kilowatt hours, which is about triple that of diesel. So for uses where weight's a big consideration, hydrogen's an extremely useful fuel. And hydrogen's extremely versatile. So you can use hydrogen to generate electricity through combustion or a fuel cell. It can be combusted to create heat. It can be used in a fuel cell vehicle, and of course it can be exported. But hydrogen can also be used as a feedstock in a number of processes which are using fossil fuels at the moment, such as creating green steel, green ammonia, and even synthetic fuels. But something that's really important to know about hydrogen is at the moment, it's primarily made through fossil fuels. So about half of all hydrogen is made with natural gas through a process called steam methane reformation. And just 4% is made with electricity through electrolysis. And similarly, almost half of the hydrogen produced currently is used for petrol recovery and the other half for ammonia production. So just 1% of global hydrogen is used for electricity. And all this means is hydrogen, if it was a country, would be the 6th most polluting country in the world. So it's really important to know where hydrogen's come from to understand if it's a green fuel. And as you can see down the bottom, different production pathways have different levels of pollution. So if you use electricity from coal-fired generation, for example, you'll produce about 40 kilos of CO2 for every kilogram of hydrogen produced. And through electricity with renewables or nuclear generation is the only way to produce hydrogen with zero greenhouse gas emissions. So something you might have started to hear in the news and other places is different colours of hydrogen. And this is just a way of marking the production pathway that was used. So green or renewable hydrogen is made through electrolysis with renewable power. Then there's blue hydrogen, which is made with natural gas with carbon capture and storage. And then brown or grey hydrogen, which is made from fossil fuels with no carbon capture and storage. And it's about 95% of production today. And finally, purple hydrogen. But green hydrogen production is on the rise. So in the last 20 years, just 253 megawatts of capacity was installed globally. And in the next 5 years, there's already 3.2 gigawatts of production in the pipeline. But something that is interesting to know is electrolysis technology isn't a new thing at all. So here you can see some centres from Norway in the 1930s and 50s, which were operating very large-scale alkaline electrolysis facilities. And really, the technology hasn't majorly changed in its form. So this is a modern facility in Norway today. So for electrolysis, there's two main technology classes. There's alkaline and more recently proton exchange membrane, or PEM. So the important thing to know about these is they're both fairly similar in efficiency. Proton exchange membrane is much more expensive, but it's quickly becoming more popular. And the reason for that is it can quickly be ramped up or down in the level of power it's accepting, and can be quickly turned on and off, whereas alkaline systems are very slow to move. And so if you're using a variable energy source such as renewables, PEM lends itself much better to following the generation profile. And so just quickly...
Does that say $3.5 million per megawatt?
That's right, yeah, that's Australian dollars. This is from last year, so it's come down slightly, but there's a lot of platinum that goes into the production of PEM electrolyzers. So just quickly to give you a feel for how electrolysis works. So this is a PEM electrolyzer. It all follows a fairly similar system, but power is supplied to the circuit, which is formed by the anode and the cathode. And then the water reacts at the anode, which is the negatively charged end, and it forms oxygen and positively charged hydrogen ions, which is just a proton. The hydrogen ions can move across the membrane and oxygen is released in the anode side. And then from there, at the cathode, the hydrogen ions combine with electrons from the energy supply to produce pure hydrogen, which is released. And another important point about hydrogen is the requirement for water. Obviously, in a country as dry as Australia, it's a big consideration if we're going to scale up production. So it takes about 12 litres of untreated water to produce 1 kilo of hydrogen, or 9 litres of deionized water. But as hydrogen produces oxygen as an output, there's a degree of circularity in that the oxygen can be used to purify the water. And for industrial uses, the water can be collected again after combustion or being put through a fuel cell and reused. So I'll hand you back over to Alex quickly for our second poll.
Cool. All right, so same thing as last time. I'll share the screen as well. So back onto poll EV. I'm going to do some word clouds this time. All right, so yeah, so don't text it. Go to pollev.com/energy. You should see this, and you can type in as many answers as you want, and it'll pop up in just a cool word cloud, and we can see sort of the things that you're most interested in, and then maybe Aidan could explain some of those things. Cars. Gas cars, sustainability. Oh, cool. Network. Clean energy. Yeah. Here's what versatility means. I guess it can be used for a lot of different things, I assume. All right. I'll let you guys go for another minute. Aircraft. Yeah. All right. Cool. Some good things there. Transportation, air. I would love to see it in aircrafts. That'd be really cool. All right, next one.
I believe Boeing are trialing some hydrogen prototype vehicles.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think so. They're for, Uber are thinking to do small scale airlift taxis.
Yeah.
I think Boeing are trialing some for that.
Yeah, we had Scott Naga on, who is the head of senior mobility with Hyundai. And Hyundai's doing all that with Uber. And they've got this concept video on YouTube, and it's the craziest thing you've ever seen. It's like Westworld. It's like things are flying everywhere, and there's these shuttles that are automatic, and it's crazy. You're like, here we go, cool, explosion.
Climate themes coming through quite strongly on this one.
The fire's not that bad, guys. That's funny though. Bit of cost, yeah. Oh man, cost is bigger than explosion. Wow. Storage. All right, I'll give you guys another minute or so. Haven't yet seen environment or air or emissions or anything like that, which is surprising.
No, Alex, I think all are thinking that this is green hydrogen or this classic or any hydrogen.
Could be any hydrogen. Like this is a thing about any hydrogen.
Yeah, if this is from natural gas or conventional method, definitely that environmental concerns are bigger.
Yeah. And there's actually an interesting article that we've put in the PDF that we're going to be sending you guys, which is about some of the concerns that have popped up around hydrogen. And it's, I guess we call it inhibits the breakdown of some greenhouse gases. So something to keep an eye on. All right, cool. Thanks. So we got cost. Still got quite a lot of explosion, fire, flammability, hype. That's an interesting one. There is quite a lot of hype around it. And I've spoken to a lot of people who are like, sounds like a red herring. But I don't know. There's a lot of money going into it. There's a lot of governments supporting it. So we'll see. All right. Cheers. Thanks, guys. And I'll hand back over to Aidan. And just if there are any questions, feel free to shout out or type them in the chat and I'll pass them along to Aidan, or Aidan will call out.
Yeah, I can't see the messages, so if you just want to stop me whenever one pops up in the chat, I'll be happy to pause and answer.
Sure.
All right, so I just want to talk to you for a bit about the pre-feasibility study that was done at Monash, because I think it's a really interesting test case and sort of showcases how versatile hydrogen is. So the pre-feasibility that we did with ONG was constrained to be at least 5 megawatts of electrolyser in size, and that was just around the renewable hydrogen funding round that ARENA was running at the time. And in the end, we ended up looking at a full 10 megawatt system. And we're exploring the viability of producing the hydrogen on or near campus, and all the uses were to be on campus as well. So another interesting aspect is we were going to be using a take or pay renewable PPA, which means we would have to use the electricity from these solar and wind resources at the same time as they're being produced. And a full 10 megawatt system was going to need about 12 megawatts of wind and 8.5 megawatts of solar to run it. And in the end, around 50% of the end hydrogen was going to go to district heating. Around 25% was going to go to gas blending, and around 25% to mobility. For the gas blending, we constrained the hydrogen to be 5% by volume, which is about 3% by energy at a maximum in the natural gas grid. And the reason for that is after that point, most industrial appliances would need to be upgraded. And some testing has shown that even as low as 3%, there'll need to be some retrofits. And one thing that this shows wrong is we were originally looking at a fuel cell, but since most of the energy was going to heat, we ended up looking instead at a hydrogen turbine, which would be a combined heat and power plant, because that produces about 70% heat and 30% electricity for the hydrogen, whereas a fuel cell will produce about 60% electricity and 40% heat. So hydrogen systems are fairly modular. The largest electrolyser you can get is about 2 megawatts. And so there's no increase in cost in doing a phased deployment. So in this pre-feasibility, we're looking at doing a 6-phase deployment whereby we'd start with 4 megawatts of electrolysis and then build up to 10 megawatts at the end. And the combined heat and power plant was going to be installed would be 1 megawatt. And you can see down the bottom that initially almost all of the hydrogen was going to heating with a little bit going to blending. And then from phase 2, we're building the refueling station and increasing the number of buses. And the other requirement that was constraining this project was that the storage would need to be on site. And so at maximum, we had 750 kilos of medium pressure storage, which is at 200 bar, and 500 kilos of high pressure storage, which would be at 500 bar. And about 250 kilos of storage is roughly 1 truck trailer. So you can imagine in the end, it's about 5 truck trailers of hydrogen that would be stored on campus. So the interesting thing about hydrogen is that the costs really vary depending on the use. So the major cost components for hydrogen are the capital expenditure on the electrolysis and the capital expenditure, the ongoing cost of renewable energy. But compression and storage are also a big cost. So the hydrogen that was coming out of the electrolyzer was going to cost about $9 a kilo. Once it made the combined heat and power, it was going to be about $10 a kilo. And once it's compressed for use in buses and waste trucks, it was going to be about $13 a kilo. But you can see in this table here, we also compared the levelized cost of hydrogen to the current polluting technology classes. So you can see on the right that currently in 2020, hydrogen doesn't really compete in many areas. It's somewhat similar in cost to the garbage trucks, and the cost for the buses isn't massively different. But by 2030, the levelized cost of hydrogen will have come down, but also the polluting technologies will be slightly more expensive. So it'll probably be able to compete for transport in Monash's case. But another consideration is the societal benefits in terms of lack of pollution, avoiding CO2, that sort of thing. And so that's something else that was also modelled. And it is feasible that a lot of societies might bring in carbon pricing over the next decade at some point, at which point the hydrogen does start to compete even now if you bring in a low societal benefit calculation. And even without carbon pricing, some governments and even corporations now are starting to consider these sorts of things when they make decisions.
What do you sort of mean by societal benefits?
So in terms of the health benefits of not having fuels combusted on campus, in terms of the benefit of not having more CO2 in the atmosphere, those sorts of benefits.
And you can put a price tag on that?
You can, that's right.
Yeah, cool.
There's some standardized prices that they use. To be honest, I'm not super familiar with how this was calculated, but I think there are some standards that are used across industry. So moving on now, I just want to talk to you about sort of where hydrogen is going and the different technology types. So you've probably been hearing a lot more about hydrogen over the last year. And some people are saying this is going to be the decade of hydrogen, including this guy from Air Liquide. And the main reason for that is falling costs. So in the last decade, the cost of electrolysis fell about 60%. And in the next decade, it's going to roughly half or fall even by 80% again. And one of the big drivers of that is the scaling up of the electrolysis industry. So you can see down the bottom there that in 2014, it cost about $2 million a megawatt for Western-made alkaline electrolyzers. And this is US dollars, sorry. And in 2019, it cost about $1.2 million. But something that's interesting to note is that even today, you can buy Chinese-made alkaline electrolyzers for as low as $200,000 a megawatt. Western companies would say that they're much lower quality, but it does show how much further the Western prices can fall as the industry scales. And obviously, PEM electrolyzers are lagging behind. And so this falling cost is going to unlock a lot of new markets. So you can see here, the dark blue lines are fuel cell. The light blue is battery and grey is petrol. And at the moment, hydrogen doesn't really compete in very many areas, but in the next 10 to 30 years, hydrogen is going to either be the better option or at least competitive for most of these technologies. And again, here you can see in the top right corner of technology classes where by 2030, hydrogen will be not only cheaper than other low carbon technologies, but it'll be cheaper than conventional fossil alternatives. And in the top left, you can see areas where hydrogen will be the cheapest low carbon alternative, but it's not cheaper than the fossils systems that are currently used. But if the world shifts to focus on decarbonising, then these will be the areas where hydrogen will come in as well. And the main thing you can see from this is it's mostly heavy vehicles and high utilisation vehicles that hydrogen's winning out on in the next decade. So export is obviously another area of focus. Australia's chief scientist, Alan Finkel, he's called exporting hydrogen shipping sunshine because it's a way of exporting our renewable energy resources to countries that don't have such high quality access to renewables or limited land available. And Australia is sitting with a pretty natural advantage. You can see this modelling by McKinsey shows that in 2030, it'll be about 40 cents cheaper a kilo to buy Australian hydrogen than it will be from Saudi Arabia, which is likely to be a major competitor for Australia by then.
Do you know why Australia would be so much cheaper?
I'm not actually sure. That's a good question. No, I don't know. Something that is interesting though is I've seen a fair few reports where they're sort of saying shipping hydrogen directly is unlikely to really take off, and it's more likely that we'll be seeing hydrogen derivatives such as ammonia being the source of export, because liquefying hydrogen for export takes about a third of the end energy to do, and it's quite expensive. Whereas ammonia has roughly a similar energy density to liquefied hydrogen. And then when you get it to the port, you just need to remove the nitrogen, you've got pure hydrogen. And then it's not pressurized as well, so it's quite safe and effective. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But essentially scaling up hydrogen, it's really going to be relying on strong government policy and probably carbon pricing. So the federal government in Australia has set a H2 under 2 target, which is to get hydrogen below $2 per kilo Australian by 2030. And a lot of governments around the world are aiming at $2 US per kilo by 2030. And then hoping again to get it down to $1 a kilo by 2050. But this is going to take a 10 times increase in electrolyzer sales in the next decade, and then a 1,000 times scale up of the industry by 2050. But we have seen these sorts of scale ups occur in other renewable technology classes, such as solar. But if the strong policy is implemented, such as carbon pricing, by 2050, around 20% of the world's emissions could be abated by hydrogen technologies. And you can see here, with no cost attached to carbon, likely just cars, buses and trucks will be where most of the hydrogen is being deployed. But at $100, things like green steel, green ammonia, green aluminium, green cement will all be competitive with hydrogen. And similarly, with strong policy, hydrogen could meet up to a quarter of the world's energy needs by 2050. And even with weak policy, it's likely to take up around 27 exajoules of energy use, mostly in transport. But just to really give you a sense of how big of a project this would be, Bloomberg's calculations found that it would cost about $11 trillion to get hydrogen to the point it would need to be at in 2050. And obviously this contains a lot of assumptions, but we are looking at 8.3 terawatts of new electrolyzers, 6 terawatts of new wind capacity to feed them, 6.3 terawatts of PV, and interestingly, 14,000 salt caverns for large-scale energy storage. So something that's being investigated a lot, particularly in Europe, is the ability of salt caverns to hold hydrogen at pressures for long periods of time, so that seasonal energy storage can be facilitated by hydrogen. But the signs that the scale-up's on track already is emerging. So by 2030, we're going to need about 300 of those $300 billion of that $11 trillion invested. But the European Commission has already announced a project which is going to require $500 billion of investment as part of their COVID recovery, with Germany committing $10 billion already. And in Australia as well, hydrogen interest is really exploding. So in the last year, almost all Australian states have released their own hydrogen strategies, and the federal government released the National Hydrogen Strategy back in November. And then most recently, the federal government's low carbon technology roadmap, which is committing $18 billion over the next decade, highlighted hydrogen as one of the 3 major technology classes they're going to be investing in. The federal government is technology neutral, so they're likely to support a lot of hydrogen from gas, possibly with carbon capture and storage facilities. They're not purely focusing on green hydrogen, but this will likely incorporate a lot of electrolyzer investment as well. So the National Hydrogen Strategy essentially steps out how Australia is going to facilitate a large export market. And so for the next 5 years, the focus is just on setting up little demonstrations, slowly building a domestic demand and testing. But then from 2025, the government's hoping to move to large-scale market activation and start exporting mainly to Asian partners. Japan, for example, is committed to importing 200,000 tonnes of hydrogen per year by 2030. And so Australia's hoping to meet a lot of that requirement. And this is a bit of an old snapshot from last year by CSIRO, but it sort of gives you a feel for where the projects that are currently being made are and the sort of things that they're doing. So almost all the projects in Australia at the moment are looking at either injecting into the gas grid for testing, setting up limited refueling systems, and hydrogen as an electrical storage. So hydrogen for transport is obviously an area a lot of people have heard of. But one thing that I think is interesting to know is a fuel cell is essentially a mechanical battery. So even in a fuel cell vehicle, you'll still find a regular battery system. And the reason for this is the output from a fuel cell isn't as quickly variable as the electric motor requires. And so in a fuel cell vehicle, you'll have quite a small capacity battery that's supplying the motor, and the fuel cell operates whenever the battery falls below a certain level and just constantly refuels it. And so these are two examples that are available in Australia. The Hyundai Nexo was the first hydrogen car which was certified for Australian roads. And then also the Toyota Mirai, which you can't purchase for yourself yet, but you can lease from Toyota if you wanted to demonstrate it. And Canberra is going to have the first publicly available refueling station. The Canberra government has bought a series of fuel cell vehicles to test. And it was meant to be already operational, but it's been delayed by COVID. So in terms of heavy vehicles, here we've got Nikola, which Alex highlighted as being sued at the moment. But they've really exploded in the last couple of years, and their Nikola 2 truck has 14,000 pre-orders. And the interesting thing to note is that they're promising an 800, or in the long range version, 1,800 kilometre range on this truck. Whereas the Tesla semi-trucks, their range is either 480 or 800 kilometres. So it can get about double the range of a battery vehicle. And the reason for this is mostly the weight. So going 1,800 kilometres in a heavy truck takes about 2 tonnes of fuel cell, versus in a battery truck, it would take about 7 tonnes of battery. And down the bottom, you can just see an example fuel cell bus, which was produced for the Tokyo Olympics. So obviously, in the word cloud, everyone highlighted that safety and fire are big considerations, and that's something I hear a lot from people. And something that's interesting to know is the highest safety rated car in Australia at the moment is a fuel cell vehicle. And so although hydrogen is extremely flammable and reactive, safety's built in. And one interesting thing to note is you can see these 5 images here of a fuel cell vehicle having its tank burst versus an internal combustion engine tank being burst. And because the hydrogen's lighter than air and pressurized, it shoots the flame away from the vehicle. Whereas in a regular car, the fuel will pull underneath the vehicle and burn the occupants. And I've actually been out to Toyota's test facility and seen these tanks down the bottom, because in a car, the hydrogen's stored at 700 bar, which is extremely high pressure, but they use an extremely thick tank. And I was told that they've done testing where they fired a 50 caliber sniper rifle at the tank, and that it takes 3 impacts at the exact same point for the tank to burst. So it's fairly unlikely to happen. So for fuel cells and electrical storage, there's a few different considerations with hydrogen. Someone highlighted they have concerns about the efficiency of hydrogen, and it's a really good point. So with batteries, the round trip efficiency of charging to discharging is about 95%. Whereas with hydrogen, the round trip efficiency currently is only 35%. And the reason for that is fuel cells aren't very efficient, and electrolysis is also somewhat inefficient. So there's a lot of waste heat there. This efficiency is increasing, but it's unlikely to ever reach similar levels to batteries. But you can see for hydrogen, the charging and discharging cost is far, far greater than it is for batteries, but the size of the storage is lower for hydrogen, and with potential for salt caverns, it could get as low as 50 cents a kilowatt hour, which is something batteries will never match. So what you're seeing on this graph here is a study done by a European company that I can no longer remember, where they were looking at charging times and trying to calculate when it's best to use batteries and when it's best to use hydrogen. And they found that currently, if you're going to charge a system for more than 15 hours, it's cheaper to use hydrogen systems. and that in the future that number is going to come down to about 12 hours. So batteries will likely still dominate into the future for daily demands. But if you're trying to, for example, store your excess solar resources for use in the winter, something like hydrogen will be a lot more viable. And then finally, hydrogen and gas networks. So ATIG and a few other gas distributors in Australia have net zero by 2050 targets. ACT government has a net zero by 2045 target for their gas network. And the way that companies are going to reach this is going to be some combination of biogas along with hydrogen. And there's a lot of testing going on worldwide to look at how much hydrogen can we inject into the gas network, what sort of retrofits will need to be conducted, how safe is it, these sorts of things. And what's mostly being found is you can inject up to about 50% into the residential distribution network if it has reasonably new pipes without having to majorly retrofit home devices. And then up to 100% is possible, but it then does require some retrofitting. And one of those trials is the Gemma trial happening in Sydney. And they've got a 500 kilowatt electrolyzer, and they're going to be supplying 250 homes with a 10% hydrogen gas blend. And this 10% number is important because the New South Wales government has actually set a 10% blending target for all of their gas networks by 2030. And so it's likely that we're going to start to see some really large demonstrations of this sort of technology. And then just finally wanted to touch on how hydrogen is exported. So at the moment, there are some trials of storing liquid hydrogen in vacuum insulated tanks at negative 252. But as I flagged earlier, it takes about a third of the end hydrogen use energy to cool the hydrogen that much. So it's likely that something else will probably take over in the future. And thank you for your time. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Thanks, Aidan. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm happy to open it to any questions that you've got. I think there's a lot in there that was useful to pick apart. So go ahead and unmute yourself if you just have a question and interrupt us, or you can put in the chat if you don't want to be unmuted.
I do have one question. So when you're talking about exports for hydrogen and using, like they're really looking at ammonia, when they take into consideration like emissions and things like that, do they consider the actual production of ammonia?
Great question. So when they're talking about ammonia production in terms of for green hydrogen, you can produce ammonia with no emissions if you use green hydrogen as the feedstock. So currently most ammonia is produced with hydrogen, which is derived from fossil fuels, and that's where the emissions come from. But when you ship green ammonia in production, there's no emissions. And then when you get to the other end, the only emissions are nitrogen, which isn't a greenhouse gas at all.
Can I ask something? Yeah, one of the slides showed that policy is critical and carbon pricing is critical. What we're seeing in the electricity industry and generally is a lack of carbon policy and a lack of carbon pricing, but it's not stopping the renewables being taken up. There's a massive transition happening to renewables and in generation in spite of the lack of policy and pricing. And it's simply because private enterprise is talking. Banks and insurance companies don't want to give financial backing to new coal-fired power stations or anything fossil fueled. Commonwealth Bank CEO was asked, why is this your policy? He said, well, it's risk-based, as everything we do is. It's too risky that fossil fuel really doesn't have a future, and we can't risk new. So I'm thinking the same on hydrogen. Is this really critical that we have to say that the governments actually have to come in and do things, Or there's so many things happening as you've described. Is it just a matter of individual organizations just doing it, basically, because they see it's necessary? And at some point, policy and regulation will catch up.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, something that we talk about a lot at ClimateWorks is how there's not much willingness for investment into new fossil assets because people see that likely they're going to become stranded in the future. And so I think as much as a carbon price can affect change, the threat of a future carbon price or green economy can also affect change without the same economic incentives. But I suppose it's around hydrogen being able to compete economically with the incumbent plants. So, for example, with a strong carbon price, steel will become more expensive than newly produced green steel. Whereas currently, if you produce green steel, as some Swedish companies are trialing, other than the market for specifically green steel, you can't compete with a fossil-derived product. So I think carbon pricing will be important if we want to completely replace the old systems.
Yeah, look, if you want to completely replace, I agree. But what I've heard from other people is that the key issue for hydrogen will be scale. And R&D is driven by money, as we know. If the money is there, if there's enough incentive, if there's enough advantage in having something, and we're seeing that in battery technology as well, everybody will pay tremendous amounts of money for the better battery, the slight edge. And so the money's going into R&D for that. So the same with hydrogen. So what I'm saying is this is not the ideal situation. The ideal situation is that you have government policy, you have your carbon pricing, everybody's working from the same page, and that's the most efficient, best way of doing it. What I'm saying is we live in a reality of the federal government potentially changing every 3 years. Even if you get a policy and a pricing, it can be zapped by the next government or even the next prime minister within the same government. And so I feel there's sort of more positive talking to be done about the transition that's happening across the energy field in the absence of policy, and that's just fine because that's the way it is, and that's the way we have to live and work with it.
No, I agree. And I think there are some developments, such as the Tasmanian government is really championing having some sort of central group that will certify green hydrogen as green. So then people that use that as the input can say, you know, this is certified zero emission. And I think in the same way, areas like steel could benefit if you had certified green steel, then some consumers might be willing to pay an extra 1 or 2% or whatever it is. And in that way, you could have sort of a grassroots scaling up as well.
Exactly. I mean, that's the way it's gone in a lot of things. That, you know, if you want to go for any government tender, it's not just about who'll do it at the lowest price and do the best job. It's what's your environmental policy, what's your greenhouse gas policy, and it's all taken into consideration. And nobody wants to be saying, you know, we use a certified product, we use certified green electricity. And as I say, that's the sort of thing that drives things more than well, you know, are we going to have a zero carbon by 2050 or are we not? We can be arguing that one till the cows come home, but I see that that people are just getting on with it, never mind, you know.
Yeah, agreed.
Thanks.
All right, were there any other questions for Aidan? I've got a...
Oh, sorry. I had a question. You mentioned about like having to find salt caverns for storage purposes. What makes them suitable for storage, or like, is there any benefits to them over man-made storages?
The main benefit to salt caverns is the scale of the storage. So a lot of salt caverns can also be manufactured. You can essentially mine out a large section from a natural salt deposit and then start injecting hydrogen into that. I must admit, I'm not entirely sure about the chemistry of why salt is so effective. I think it just isn't overly porous and can hold hydrogen at quite high pressures without causing significant issues. But I think the other main strength of salt is that it's quite easy to mine out. And so it's not incredibly expensive to make these salt caverns, and there are a number of salt caverns that are storing natural gas at the moment. But to answer your question fully, I'm not exactly sure why salt is the winner.
Okay, thanks.
No problem.
I think Woodside or something was also looking at using just natural gas reservoirs or something. Like, I think Australia is not short of reservoirs in Western Australia and the Northern Territory. So
yeah, there's a lot of that work happening in the Netherlands at the moment as well, because of course in Europe they've got large amounts of gas storage because they get all their gas from Russia, and so they're always worried about running out in the winter. And so they're saying, can it store pure hydrogen at what pressures, and how much will it cost to retrofit all this infrastructure?
I've got a question. You hear a lot in the media about, I guess, the importance of bringing manufacturing into Australia. Will hydrogen play a big role in that? Or will it mostly be used for like exporting hydrogen or in the grid?
That's a great question. Hydrogen can play a really important part in manufacturing if we're looking to not just bring back manufacturing, but also decarbonize manufacturing. So there's not a lot that hydrogen can do that we can't do with fossil fuels. But in terms of decarbonizing the industry, you've got sort of two main tools that you can use. You can either electrify your industrial processes, but for some things you need a higher value source of heat. And in that case, combusting hydrogen can produce the same kind of quality heat that natural gas can. But hydrogen also, interestingly, is already cheaper than diesel for and battery systems for forklifts. So, I mean, it's not a major part of manufacturing, but Amazon, for example, is replacing all their forklifts with hydrogen fuel cell forklifts. So there will be likely a lot of hydrogen deployed in industry.
One thing I've heard is that you can retrofit hydrogen to things like forklifts, but you can't retrofit batteries for some reason. I don't know why, but I heard from the AGIG that the reason they look at hydrogen is because you can retrofit them so easily compared to a battery electric forklift.
Yeah, that's the same with a lot of industrial machinery as well. Like if you're replacing gas with hydrogen, you don't have to come in and replace all your equipment. You just have to change the nozzles a little bit and, a little bit of tinkering, which isn't massively expensive. Whereas if you try to electrify all your systems, you've got to rip everything out and put in all new equipment.
Yeah, and there's actually a thing going on at the moment. They're replacing a lot of the steel pipelines with polyethylene, which is fine for hydrogen. So, and that's just to do with natural gas leakage. So we might be able to get the proper pipelines just before we even go into the hydrogen economy, which would be great, because that would stop all the leakage and all the decaying of the pipes. All right, are there any more questions? I've got one more poll, which is just sort of a wrap-up poll to see how you guys are thinking. So if there are any more questions, I'll pop that open. Shouldn't be too long. It's just an open-ended question to see how you guys are going. I'll turn your screen off as well, Aidan.
Yeah.
Yes, great. Yeah. All right, so let's jump back on to poll everywhere. It's up here, pollev.com/moratenergy. And just tell us, sort of after today, what your thoughts are on hydrogen, if you think we should be investing in it. And yeah, I mean, you can also ask a question here if you'd like. Just interested to see what you guys are thinking.
Quickly, I should add as well, in regards to the Monash project, just while you guys are answering, essentially what it's moving to now is we still need to do a bit more work in pre-feasibility to assess the trade-offs between electrifying all the processes and using hydrogen. So likely it won't go to full feasibility until sometime next year, hopefully with a little bit of help from either the Victorian Hydrogen Investment Program or ARENA. But I do know, I think civil engineering students, it's one of their capstone units, are doing an assessment of a hydrogen and organic waste facility on a piece of Monash land as well.
All right. Oh, I can scroll. All right, what do we got here? Great potential. Great potential to be low cost to current fuels. Exciting potential. Exciting applications. Find ways to fine tune the process. Yeah, I feel like that'll come. Just like, you know, you look at batteries and how far they've come. Like yesterday, they had the EV. I'm not muted. No, they have the battery day yesterday for Tesla, and they just decreased the price of batteries by like 50% or something. Like something absolutely crazy. All we need is some sort of Elon type person to jump into the hydrogen train, and I think we'll see the same sort of drop in prices, and that'll be the solution to this fine tuning. Explore it more. Yes. All right. Awesome. Well, I'll close this now.
I do have just one question. I just want to hear your perspective. So I guess, like we saw in the poll, a lot of concern is around safety and explosion and kind of that stereotypical things you think of when you think hydrogen, or like the general public. I'm just wondering, like, how, and this is kind of an open-ended question, but I guess how do you kind of put people's mind at ease without going into like full depth of the chemistry of hydrogen? Like, do you find that there's an easy kind of way to kind of ease people's minds, or is it still just quite a tricky topic to approach?
Yeah, I think in general, people find any sort of new or exotic risk to be a lot scarier than the risk that they're already familiar with. You know, when you're driving around your car normally, you're essentially driving around a bomb already in terms of all the fuel that you're sitting on top of. When you go to campus, you regularly walk by compressed gases and you probably don't feel too uneasy about it. You know, there's natural gas distribution pipelines under all your houses and in the streets. And so I think education is a big part. People need to understand that the Hindenburg and those sorts of things that come to mind don't represent hydrogen. But I also think that people will just slowly become more familiar with seeing hydrogen assets and become more comfortable with them as time goes by, and, you know, everything isn't exploding all the time. Certainly, as with all technologies, people test these things extensively. They engineer them with large safety margins, and like any other compressed gas, they know that it's not going to happen except for in extremely rare cases.
All right. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I think we can begin to wrap it up today. Thank you. I'll just interrupt me if you see something comes up. But yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you everyone. And thank you very much, Aidan, especially for agreeing to speak and preparing these slides and getting everything going. Something in the chat. Oh, what's going on? I'm clicking everything.
Just says thanks.
All right. Okay. Yeah. So thank you everyone. We've got a few weeks break until our next event, but the next event is most likely going to be the energy hack, and Woodside is sponsoring was going to be one of the partners for that. So while I can't promise it, I'd be surprised if their pitch problem wasn't to do with hydrogen. So that might give you a chance to actually do a little bit of work on creating a hydrogen business plan and getting your name seen by quite a few industry professionals. So we'll be working with Vestas, who is the world's largest manufacturer of wind turbines, the Energy Institute, which is all the research that goes on at Monash, Woodside, Monash Talent is going to be there. So they're the ones who sort of scout for those smart people and put them in touch with the places that you want to work for. We're being supported by the Monash Generator. So if the winning team will actually have their idea taken and sort of be guided and then you can progress through the generators, things, the workshops that they run to make sure that your idea actually comes to fruition. And we're actually working as well with Borrow Cup, who has a cool new platform coming out to spur along innovation. So a whole load of people are going to be there that are going to be, scouting for employees and smart people. So you can sign up as an individual or as a team of 4, and you can find the links on our socials. Apart from that, I don't think I have anything else to say. You'll all be sent a PDF with some of the information that you've been told today, along with a couple other companies to look out for. I put in chat a link to this conference that's coming up. It's free for students, and it's all about hydrogen startups that are probably going to be looking for employees and students. So that's a really good thing to go to. I think it's next month. And also check out the Australian Hydrogen Council if you want to really see what every single company is doing, who's supporting a hydrogen economy. But I think that's it from me. Aidan, is there anything else you want to say?
Thanks for coming out to listen, everyone. I appreciate you giving up some time in your day.
All right. Well, have a good mid-semester break. You've got a week and a half left of it. So use it wisely. And we'll see you guys later. See you.
Yeah. Bye.